All right, welcome to another episode of the C-Masc Podcast. It's just me and Mike today because the others are either otherwise engaged or feeling unwell. So today we're looking at the duties of Christian laymen in professing and defending the faith. We'll be thinking about some of the comments that Pope Leo XIII made in his encyclical on Christians as citizens. And we'll be very happy to take questions as we go through. So please add those to the chat as we go. Now, Mike, when I first read this essay, this encyclical letter, a lot of it was new to me. And I was surprised at how much is actually expected of laymen, especially in times that are difficult for Christianity, like contemporary culture. Have you been aware of what the demands on us are before?
No, not at all. Not until you sent me this article and with this encyclical, and it was pointed out. Yeah, I don't think that many Catholics, and particularly many Catholic men, get that type of account of obligations to be actively out in the world defending the faith. Rather, it's nothing taught to me when I was younger, certainly.
Yeah, exactly. I think so many people have had that experience, and it's part of the general weakening of the role of the father and of men in civil society because people are supposed to be making more of a stand than they are. So we need to make our presence felt more.
It's funny how the when you look on the left, I mean, there's such a ethic of activism, of pick your topic, right? Anywhere on the left, there's a million and one activist causes that people get behind, whether it's related to the environment or animals or whatever, LGBT or social justice of any stripe or variety. You don't when you hear activism, you think of leftist activism. You don't, I mean, other than the March for Life, really, Catholic activism, getting out there in the world, is just mentally. I don't think that's something people associate in the culture at all.
Right. And yet, apostle literally means one sent. And we're supposed to be communicating the faith to everybody,
Hmm.
ultimately.
Hmm.
So if
Yeah.
you think about what the commandments of the faith are, I'm just going off Callan and McHugh's Moral Theology, that pair of volumes. It's a really great reference for anybody who wants to know more about this. They give three. One must acquire knowledge and understanding of one's faith according to one's state in life and duties. So that's a duty. One must believe internally the truths of faith. And thirdly, one must profess externally one's belief. So we've got to learn about it. We have to believe it internally, but crucially, we also have to profess it externally. And that's for the spiritual good of our neighbor. So part of loving your neighbor is professing your external belief in the faith. Makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, that would naturally follow, it seems. Yeah, what's the point if you have all this internal knowledge and beliefs and they don't take any outward expression in terms of real day-to-day behavior or interaction with folks? Yeah, it seems like there's something off if that were the case.
Now, thinking about the way in which liberalism, which I know you're currently working on an article on, uh, purports to be neutral. That's not quite the case, is it? Because really, it's okay with religion as long as it's something that's relegated very much to the private space, like something naughty that you do at home in your bedroom. You can be religious there.
Right, yeah, yeah. As long as it doesn't get in the way of, I guess, day-to-day commerce too much, then yeah, it's fine. But yeah, once it starts becoming something that, yeah, that's not private, that's something that is bleeding out into the public sphere, then yeah, that becomes a problem for the liberal social order, because then people don't like the idea of other people having thick values commitments in a public space that's committed to merely thin values commitments, to a thin pluralism.
That's right. It reminds me of that really cutting remark that Christopher Dawson had when he said that if the state has become too totalitarian, it's because the average Christian hasn't been totalitarian enough.
Oh, wow. I've never heard that before. But yeah, it seems like there's going to be a power gap. There's going to be a void that is filled one way or the other in the public space. And it's either going to be filled with religion, state, or like dumb market jingles. It's going to be like Gillette razor blades or something. Like that'll be what fills the space of the public good.
Yeah, right. Now, thinking about what truths that must be known by everyone capable of the knowledge, Callan and McHugh argue that it's these. So, this is the bare minimum that everyone has to know about Christianity. Number one, we have a supernatural destiny, and Christ is the way that leads to it. Then we've got four basic truths which come under that umbrella. You've got God is our last end. We've got the Trinity, the Incarnation, and God as the remunerator. In addition to that, we've also got the other truths to which Christ wishes us expressly to assent, and the duties, general or particular, that he wishes us to fulfill. And under this category, they come the doctrine contained in the creed, the commandments and ordinances of Christ concerning the sacraments and prayer, and the special obligations of each one's particular state or office. And the idea is that all lay persons need to know these according to their age and capacity, which is an interesting qualification. So, more is expected of people who are intellectuals, for example. Like Aquinas had more of a duty to understand and to communicate the fundamentals of the faith than the average guy did because of the strength of his intellect. This makes sense too, right? So the more we've been given, the more is expected of us.
Yeah, certainly. That makes perfect sense.
It also means that a lot more is required of the average father, for example, in his Christian life, not just catechizing his own children, which I think is something that has been neglected in recent decades. And we can no longer assume, sadly, that it's going to be done traditionally or well, even if it's done at church. So fathers can't be complacent about this. They have to do it themselves in addition to whatever is happening outside church, outside the home, in church. For example, I add about an extra hour of driving to go to a particular church where I know they're going to get really good catechesis. I could go to a church much closer to my home, but I know that the priest, the one I drive to that's further away, is going to do a better job, more traditional. But I still use the Baltimore Catechism at home with my kids just to double down on it, because the best thing that a father can give his children, more so than any kind of financial legacy, is a really sound education in Catholic doctrine.
Yeah, I think that's wise, and it sounds like the a good use of an extra hour of driving time versus having a weakened or watered down catechesis. That I think, for me anyways, speaking of which, a watered down catechesis growing up was one of the things that drove me away from the faith, because it just got bulldozed by a slightly more sophisticated, sort of flat-footed new atheist view that at the time I was just like, oh wow, this is the bee's knees. This is new. I hadn't heard this before. So yeah, I think there's weak catechesis, I think, is probably one of the greatest like tools of the left that are used against us.
For
So
sure.
I think a strong catechesis is that's yeah, just start with good foundations, then you're not thrown off the path.
Right. And notice how, as we say so often, that's a weakness that opens up due to a dereliction of duty on the behalf of men. So people like you, when you're growing up, you're susceptible to that. I mean, I was as well. I spent nearly 10 years with a pretty hardcore Nietzschean worldview that now I can pick holes in really quickly and see straight through. But at the time, it was so convincing to me. And I thought
Hmm.
that Jesus was effeminate. I thought there are no really good arguments for classical theism. And these are all mistakes that I can help people through relatively straightforwardly now if they'll listen and if they'll read. But
Hmm.
I had to learn the hard way. And it'd been much
Yeah.
better if someone had sat me down and said, look, logically, here's how we set this out. And this is the secure foundation for you.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. I mean, we also have the the advent of the internet too. That helps, you know. And there's a lot more resources out there that are good resources, you know, sophisticated resources that people can get their hands on for free. In communities, they can bring people up to speed in a lot better ways than just trying to just triangulate all on your own.
Mm, yeah, for sure. So Pope Leo XIII says, we declare it to be very profitable and consistent with the requirements of the time, that each one, according to the measure of his capacity and intelligence, should make a deep study of Christian doctrine. Now, notice that he links this to the requirements of the time. And this was 1890, he was writing. And his encyclicals, if you go through them all, form, in my opinion, one of the best overviews of the diagnosis of the problems with modernity and also how to fix them. So,
Mm.
people wanting to understand why he's recommending that we get fathers in particular, but laymen more broadly, studying the faith and professing it openly. It's because he could see what was already starting back then, and it's only become worse since he was writing. So there we go again with the according to the measure of his capacity and intelligence. Now, this is part of what we're trying to do with the whole C-Masc podcast, isn't it? Because we all like to read, we like to talk, and we're trying to communicate the ideas. And I think that Tim, in particular, is a model of what this involves because we've got a guy with a strong mind who's really well read, who's articulate, and his whole social media output is about the clarification, exposition, and defense of the faith.
Hmm. Yes. Yeah. Certainly. Yeah. That I think he would be like the 21st century model of what Pope Leo's uh, talking about. Yeah, in accordance with the times. Yeah.
That's it. The more degenerate things get around you, the more of a duty you have to study this and to push back
Mm.
against it. So, the way Leo phrases this, he says that when necessity compels, not those only who are invested with power of rule are bound to safeguard the integrity of faith, but as St. Thomas maintains, each one is under obligation to show forth his faith, either to instruct and encourage others of the faithful or to repel the attacks of unbelievers. So, this is an obligation. It's not just an optional thing.
Yeah. Yeah. The I think that's a very good point. I'm just wondering, like in this day and age, I'm just thinking that he's not a Catholic, but he is, I think, a very good debater with respect to defending Christianity against um, your uh, Four Horsemen guys. Is David Lane Craig, and he made a point where somebody was saying, you know, like I want to get into an online debate, or I want to get into a debate with some atheist debater at my school or online. Should I do this? And David Lane Craig's response I thought was very good, where he said, "Look, you know, this isn't just a regular debate. Like you really are representing a a Christian worldview here. So you best you go into it having practiced, and don't let your zeal, like zeal is good, and recognizing you have that obligation is good, but don't go in half cocked and not know how to debate and get embarrassed and embarrass the faith in the process. So I don't think that that's a it's a word. It's not a cop out, but it's also a thing that I think folks ought to take seriously. Right? Is that like zeal needs to be managed in accordance with like competence in speaking and debate.
Yeah, that's right. I'll tell you what, another guy who's not Catholic but has done a good job of defending some of the fundamental truths of the faith, nevertheless, is Jay Dyer. So
Yes. Yeah.
Jay will be out there debating atheists of various stripes or naturalist guys. So there's something to be learned from non-Catholics as well regarding what this looks like.
Mhm.
So that was a good example to bring up, reminded me of him too. So what does it look like if we don't do this? Leo says to recoil before an enemy or to keep silence when, from all sides, such clamours are raised against truth is the part of a man either devoid of character or who entertains doubt as to the truth of what he professes to believe. In both cases, such mode of behaving is base and is insulting to God, and both are incompatible with the salvation of mankind. I love that. So, here are your options. You can either stay silent because you're a weak character. You don't have the courage or the integrity to actually step into the battle of ideas. Or maybe you don't think it's worth fighting for because you're not sure
Mm.
whether it's true. Now, which one do you think is more prominent generally? Which attitude? Or is it a mixture of both?
I think it's probably a mixture of both, but I mean they're definitely deeply, deeply connected. Um, my instinct is to think that it's probably more so the second, though, for folks rather than the first. Getting back to my earlier point about the weak catechesis and just very watered down, unsophisticated account of Christianity that a lot of people were brought up with. And if you're brought up with that, and then it gets bulldozed or subverted by the ethic of the time and of modern culture, a lot of people don't, like, they just move on with their lives. They don't have a reason to like reinvestigate or to rebolster those first principles. They just go, oh well, those are just some stories that the adults told me when I was younger, and now I'm going to move on with my life. So I think that the the doubt, I think, is often the precursor to the absence of front-facing evangelization or defense.
Right. If you don't understand it well, then you're not going to be rationally convinced of it fully or able to make that case to somebody else. And this is part of the confusion about faith generally in modern times, especially among men, as
Mhm.
being something which is opposed to reason. Faith is wishy washy, it's just a vague feeling you have, and it's got nothing to do with philosophy.
Right,
Uh,
right. Yes, it's just William Jamesian. I'm just gonna will myself. I'm just gonna squint my eyes and force my beliefs to be a particular way. It's like, no, that's not it's not Catholic doctrine. That's not what we're talking about.
So, fideism, the idea that
Mm.
it's just blind faith, is a position condemned by the church. And what we mean by faith instead is really that you have a rational basis for everything you're believing, including the revealed truths that you can't grasp fully, like the Trinity, for example. You
Mm.
can't disprove it rationally, but neither can you grasp it fully. That's what makes it a mystery. But you can make the rational case for believing in that revelation, having faith in it, because of what can be established about God with certainty via natural reason alone.
Yep. Yep. And I think also, yeah, our conscience and also the moral law and our capacity to reason, all these things they all undergird and point towards a culmination of faith. So like you can at least lean on those foundations in the ways that your secularist, the secular humanist and atheist they'll help themselves to those things when it's helpful. Talking about the badness of misgendering somebody or something like that, but that's still presupposing that there's some good or bad in the world at all. So all their entire ontology and normative structure is founded on nothing. But it's not obvious in the mainstream when that's you're hit with that so much. It's hard to listen to hear it.
Right. And the number one thing that guys who've been raised with that misconception need to understand is that truth is ultimately a person with a capital T, God.
Yep.
This isn't just some abstract idea. So the idea that reason could somehow be unrelated to faith is absurd when God is primarily something grasped by the intellect. That's what its final cause is ultimately. When we're seeking knowledge, we're seeking truth, and truth with the capital T, God himself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like what Peter Yeach said at the end of God and Truth, that these are the only two things that are worthy of worship, and they're in fact one and the same.
Precisely. Now, what does it involve then if we are either devoid of character, so don't want to engage in debate, or we have doubt about what we believe? Leo says that this kind of conduct is profitable only to the enemies of the faith, for nothing emboldens the wicked so greatly as the lack of courage on the part of the good. Moreover, want of vigor on the part of Christians is so much the more blameworthy, as not seldom little would be needed on their part to bring to naught false charges and refute erroneous opinions. And by always exerting themselves more strenuously, they might reckon upon being more successful. A little goes a long way then. Not seldom little would be needed on their part to bring to naught false charges.
Yeah. What's that quote about who says this? It's like just in order for evil to propagate, it just requires that the good do nothing, or the good stand back. And yeah, it's like a society being overrun by weeds, and if we could just make some preventative efforts to de-weed every once in a while, that goes a long way. It doesn't have to be this massive Herculean effort. Just trying to do something, anything, is a step in the right direction.
Yeah, I like the weeding image because a garden, if you don't put the effort in, is naturally going to tend towards disorder. Like it's going to look pretty bad relatively
Mm-hmm.
quickly. And the reality of original sin having wounded both the intellect and the will, not totally, but significantly, the reality of original sin having wounded the intellect and the will is that human nature is inclined towards disorder. Like vice comes easily, and so does
Mm-hmm.
error as well. So when we're
Yep.
working, when we're toiling in the gardens of the mind too, in the intellectual life, we need that constant pruning. We need that weeding
Yes.
because it's so easy for people to fall prey to mistakes.
it's easy for individuals to fall prey to mistakes, and I mean, we're social animals, so a lot of times our intellect will be caught up or overridden by the social moment and by what the group is doing. So on mass, you can have, as history has shown many times, you can have mass error that occurs as well.
That's right. We've got a question here. Prior to Adam eating the apple, man had no intellect, though. No, that's not correct. So, in fact, prior to the fall, Adam had greater intellectual powers than fallen man did. So, by intellect, we mean his rational powers. Those got weakened, darkened after the fall. So, he was a rational being prior to the fall and also had extra supernatural graces that went beyond merely human nature. And we lost all those through original sin. Now, Leo's really clear that Christians are born for combat. And I chose that quotation for the thumbnail for the live stream, born for combat, because this is such an important thing to remember. Being in the world as it is, we're essentially behind enemy lines our whole lives. That's what being a Christian involves. In the
Mm.
world, but not of the world. And to assume that you're going to get through life without conflict in that situation is ridiculous. It's a misunderstanding of life at its most fundamental level.
Yeah, it is, and it's yeah, I think that is the condition that we're in. I was just thinking how getting back to the point of being in an otherwise liberal social order, I think that waters down another element of like people like showing their convictions publicly and being willing to uh, generate conflict, right? I mean, I remember growing up, the adults used to say to be polite. You know, when you're talking to people, when you go over to their house for dinner, when you meet somebody, there's three things you don't talk about. You don't talk about religion, politics, or money. So right, so like the to be a political or a polite person in a social liberal setting is to to be a good person, so to speak, is to tamp down on all of these things. And then if you're leaning forward about any of those convictions, then somehow in the present social order you're looked at as a fanatic or a zealot, or you're being impolite and you're imposing your beliefs on other people, and that's the one thing we don't do here in this society. That's something that you do in your home.
Yeah. Whereas actually, as Aquinas points out, you can sin by excess of pleasing. If you're just trying to go along to get along, then that can be detrimental to the
Mm.
spiritual good of your neighbor. So on Twitter, sometimes I will engage with guys who think that fornication is a really great idea and it makes them alpha. And I'll say, no, it's not. You're going to hell if you don't repent, because
Mm.
I'll be held responsible for that at my particular judgment if I'm condoning that sin. And they probably won't listen, but one of them might. And then maybe that will turn his life around. So
Yep.
it's a good thing to actually try to correct behavior, to correct error. That's why the whole point of professing the faith is the spiritual good of our neighbor. So if you're
Hmm.
tolerating lies in other people, you're damaging them, and you're also failing yourself too.
Right, right. Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. Complicity is such a, yeah, it's such a subtle evil that I think a lot of folks don't take nearly as seriously, or I certainly never took it as seriously in the past. And yeah, I think it to just be the polite person that sits quiet and doesn't kick up too much dirt, and like you're thinking something and you want to say it, but it would be disruptive. That yeah, that can be an evil in and of itself. That yeah, it's not doing the other person any good, and it's not doing you any good either.
Yeah. I've lost friends because of behaving in this way. But the truth is that if you don't speak the truth like that, then you're not really being a friend. And you can't really maintain a friendship with someone who's making those kind of mistakes without becoming at least somewhat like them in those respects. So it's best just to speak the truth and then accept the consequences.
Yeah, yeah, I think makes perfect sense.
So Leo's point then, to recap, is that Christians are born for combat, whereof the greater the vehemence, the more assured, God aiding, the triumph. And he quotes, "Have confidence, I have overcome the world." So this is why we've mentioned before in our Best of the West book club sessions as well. When people say the battle is hopeless, you guys are crazy, let's just go out and fornicate and enjoy the decline. Let's make the most of it while we can, make merry.
Right.
The response to that is that, one, you're still doing things that are wrong in themselves and it's sinful, so it's contrary to your own nature, it's going to damage you. You can't live a good life like that. But also, in our corner as backup, as the military commander and the apostles, it's a military metaphor, really. They're baptized with fire as well, with water, and it's one sent into battle. Who have we got as reinforcement? The infinite power.
We have truth itself. Yeah,
that's
truth
right.
That incarnated. That's a good thing to have.
Yeah, exactly right.
And it's the only thing worthy of defense.
For sure. So the courage needs to come from a rational understanding of what that involves, and the fact that when God makes promises, he keeps them.
Well said.
So how come we need to do anything then? If the world has been overcome, why does it involve us? Leo says that Christ, in his loving kindness, would assign to us a share in obtaining and applying the fruits of salvation procured through his grace. Now, what do you understand by this? So, Christ actually wants us to get involved in the fight and have some part to play in the victory.
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to us being entities with free will and agency, and if he were just to command us around like toy soldiers, then it wouldn't be any good or worse for us. We would just be these inert, deterministic, like toys. But the fact that we do have agency and we do have free will, then that gives us the ability to choose good, to choose right, to choose the things that are ultimately good for us.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And I'm trying to think of some analogies to help people grasp this point. And one of them that comes to mind is that when I was a kid, I used to really love helping out with DIY stuff with my dad. He used to be an architect. He's really handy with tools, and he was always building stuff, fixing stuff. And sometimes he would do most of it and then get me to finish it, like the finishing touches to whatever was being done. And, he could have done it himself much more easily and faster. But I was thinking, wow, I helped a bit. And it was a good
Mm.
thing to get involved, and then you take pride in it. And then he obviously got a kick out of seeing his son
Yep.
performing something, learning something as well. So
Hmm.
that's the way in which I can make sense of this a little bit. So
Yep.
you want people to be involved because that means they take part in it. There's pride in that. There's honor in that. So it's better than doing it all yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I think that's a great analogy.
Right. Returning then to the point we opened with about what being born for combat truly entails. Leo says that it chiefly consists in professing openly and unflinchingly the Catholic doctrine and in propagating it to the utmost of our power. So note that unflinchingly and to the utmost.
Mm.
Now, I certainly haven't read as many books as I could have done or understood them all as well as I could have done or articulated them clearly to people who might struggle with the books themselves. Now, this is one of the things I think all of us can do more of because there are so many kind of low-lying, low-hanging misconceptions about Catholicism that can be cleared up if more people take to addressing them.
Yeah, certainly. I think, yeah, just starting out with something like Trent Horn's Catholic Answers could be a good, beginning step to begin filling in those gaps and to be getting just a little bit sharper with if people ask you about the faith and nuances of it, to have some sort of ready-made, easily digestible answers. I know in Elliot's chat that we did two weeks ago, we were answering that where there's so many misconceptions about the term papal infallibility, right? So it's like that if we could just clear that up for folks, that I think would be a huge win because I think that's probably the single greatest detractor to Catholicism is that phrase. Is that misconception? It's, I think, has repelled so many people from taking Catholicism seriously because they just hear it and they don't understand what it's about. They go, "Oh, well, you think that the Pope's infallible in all things?" No, but that's what people think.
Right. Look, we got a question about that in the chat. Look, what do you think about the Pope's stance on LGBT lifestyles? So, a lot of people, the logic goes like this. Pope Francis seems like he approves LGBT or is at least really sympathetic to it. I guess that means he can't be infallible and that Catholicism is wrong at that really fundamental level. So I'm going to be either Protestant or Orthodox, or maybe give up on the whole of Christianity and just become something else entirely, like just a grow towards the sun, pagan hippie, because at least
Mhm.
that's better than supporting LGBTQ.
Yeah,
But
all on the misconception of that term.
yeah, that's
Like
that's how it
that
works.
line
Yeah,
of reasoning works if that term is correct. But yeah, that's where the whole like chain of reasoning breaks.
for sure. Now, just to quickly answer this, the catechism is unchanged. Still says that homosexual acts are objectively disordered. So if you're thinking that when Francis says that homosexuality should be legal all over the world and there should be no laws against gays whatsoever, and that's somehow an exercise of infallibility, no, it's not. Most things that popes say aren't actually exercises in infallibility at all. Is really strictly defined, and it relates to matters of faith and morals where they're saying that the whole community is bound by what's being said. So even most encyclicals aren't, strictly speaking, infallible. And if more people understood that, then they could see that any given pope can have a particular opinion. And even if they don't like that opinion, it doesn't somehow mean it's a failure of the pontiff in general. It's not about the failure of the position of the pope. I never
Yeah, well
understood
said.
that when I was a kid. When I was a teenager, papal infallibility for me was one of the main reasons why I thought Catholicism was ridiculous.
Yep. Yeah. It's that term. We need a different term, but yeah, I think that repels a lot of folks. That misconception.
Right. We've got another question that we'll talk about in a second. I'll just pop it on the screen so I don't forget about it. So, Leo's next point is that no one, however, must entertain the notion that private individuals are prevented from taking some active part in this duty of teaching. So, what he means by this is it's not just the duty of the bishops and the priests, especially those on whom God has bestowed gifts of mind with the strong wish of rendering themselves useful. So, notice that phrase, gifts of mind. There's that line in the Gospels, isn't there, about from him to whom much has been given, much from him to whom much has been given, much shall be required.
Yep. Yeah, makes sense that certain capacities engender corresponding duties. If you're Michael Phelps and somebody's drowning in the pool and you're just standing there looking, I mean, you're doing something much worse than the guy that can't swim. It's if you have those capacities and you can use them and you don't, then yeah, you're failing in your duty in some way.
That's it. And in that example, he's just not swimming if he doesn't jump in to help. But what we actually get with some intellectuals who've got these gifts of mind is that it's not that they're not writing, it's actually that they're writing things that are contrary to truth. They're propagating error instead. And this is where
Oh
things
yeah,
get
yeah.
Really chilling, where
Phelps like throwing buckets of water on the guy or something. I don't know what the analogy might break down a bit, but yeah, that's that sort of thing.
that's it. So the phrase that the medieval theologians had is that the corruption of the best becomes the worst. And this
Yep.
is the principle explaining the fall of Lucifer,
Mm-hmm.
Lightbringer, to Satan, adversary. So the man gifted with a strong mind who uses it to attack the faith, for example, somebody like Nietzsche would be a good example.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
What you've got there is more of a perversion than the average dude who just makes a couple of intellectual blunders.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. It's yeah, his capacity to do something to glorify God and to do something good for the world. If you invert that, then I mean he created a lot more damage than the average person without those capacities, one way or the other.
That's right. And this is why, interestingly, you get those intellectuals making far more absurd errors and falling into contradictions in a way that the average person doesn't. So, who was it? Pascal, I think. Somebody pointed out that there's no position so absurd that some philosopher hasn't maintained it. And we've got the jokes about
Right.
the
Yeah.
guy
Yeah.
who's, so busy thinking about some ridiculous proposition that he falls down a well.
Yeah. Or Peter Singer, running around the world, convincing people that bestiality is like a sensible position. I mean, that's far more damage than just some average person that doesn't have that reach or doesn't have that g- gifts of sophistry to convince people.
Wait, what? You mean bestiality is an alpha?
That's the new alpha. It's gonna be sold to the public as alpha in 2023. He predicted it now. It's coming.
I,
They got
I
that lined up.
I thought that when alpha guys just feel lust, they just seize on whatever the object of lust is, like a bird of prey, and they're unstoppable.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. What could be more alpha than procreating with or copulating with a wolf? You know. But,
That's it.
uh,
All right. So, point here is that the more gifts you've been given, the more is expected of you, and the more disordered it is to squander them. It's kind of a scary thought, actually, to think what somebody like Aquinas or Aristotle might have been able to achieve had they devoted themselves to attacking the faith. I mean,
mm,
ultimately, they wouldn't have been able to succeed because it is true. And in all his articles, Aquinas does steelman the arguments against himself anyway. But
mhm.
you could certainly do a great job of bamboozling the average person if you had an intellect like that, couldn't you?
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Yeah. 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 That is a scary thought. Yeah. What a bizarro Aquinas would be, or you know, uh, a comic or whatever, like comic book villain Aquinas would amount to. Yeah, that is a scary thought.
Well, the reason it's scary is because what you end up with there is what the devil is, because you've got there the most, some people say the highest angel, so just basically one down from God, um,
Yep.
devoting all his gifts to attacking the truth.
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
So it's not just priests, it's not just bishops, it's every man according to the gifts that he's been given. And Leo says that so often as circumstances demand, laymen may take upon themselves not indeed the office of the pastor, but the task of communicating to others what they have themselves received, becoming, as it were, living echoes of their masters in the faith. Now, I really like that image, being a living echo. So,
Hmm.
we know about the importance of spiritual works of mercy and to help people who are experiencing doubt. And if you have read and understood some of the masters of the faith and can articulate the ideas well, then that delivered to the right person at the right time can be a great benefit to them.
Yeah. 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 Definitely. Definitely. Yeah. Living echo is a very good phrase. Um, yeah, I think that should be something we aspire towards.
This question that not all social conservatives are religious or Catholic, and that if you want to save the West, then talk about politics, not religion, is an interesting one. Do you want to
Mhm.
have a go answering that first? That the most important thing is politics, not religion. It seems to me to assume that politics and religion are somehow ultimately disconnected and we can separate them off from each other.
Mhm.
Whereas Christianity has always made a distinction between church and state, but not a separation.
Yeah. Well, I mean, both politics and religion is going to be laden with a metaphysical, epistemological, and normative or ethical component to it. So you can't escape that. And uh, the at least one of the explanations that, be it Aristotle or Aquinas, uh, or Maimonides, or even some, it doesn't even have to be within the Christian faith, right? But any of these classic arguments for God will say that all those they're undergirded by a theistic God, right? They're undergirded by a necessary being. So now we're talking, our attempt to bolster or to like prop up the foundations of politics already takes us back to more fundamental foundations about theism and God. So already we're talking about religion. So I think we can't help ourselves to the foundations of political thought without helping ourselves to religious thought first.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. So politics is ultimately a branch of moral philosophy because it concerns what is good for man. What policies ought we to pursue? So the second you hear guys on the non-Christian right, some of the pagan dissidents saying that liberalism is bad and we need to do this instead. Well, they're right about the fact that liberalism is bad. That's true. But what's the basis for what we need to do instead? Why is that a good thing for human beings? What is it about the nature of human beings that means this policy is going to lead to human flourishing? Fundamentally, it concerns what is man? What's the metaphysical anthropology of a human being? And the Catholic answer is that we go back to Aristotelism and the idea that man being rational is also by nature social, and we have a supernatural destiny, and the function of the state is to help us to that last end, which is why the state is subordinated to the church ultimately.
Yeah, you can't have just free floating, like a free floating political theory or political commitments that aren't grounded in anything. So you really start tracing back, well, what grounds any of these normative claims, these claims about how society ought to be ordered, what's good for individuals, what's good for the group, why a certain political ordering or political scheme is better than the other, then yeah, you're going to have to eventually get back to more fundamentals. And then as you keep digging, you'll get back to fundamental questions about God.
Right, that's exactly right. Good quote from Dean in the chat. Pope Pius X, primary duty of charity does not lie in toleration of false ideas. So, good reminder that tolerance
I like that.
or like free speech isn't a value in itself.
Yeah, this is it also reminds me of the Chesterton quote about tolerance is a symptom of a society with no convictions. And yeah, it's tolerance and free speech are not the highest ideal.
Right. Tolerance is the Trojan horse of nihilism if you make it a good in itself.
Mm.
There's that Chesterton one as
Yeah.
well about the point of having an open mind is like the point of opening your mouth, which is to close it on food for nourishment. Like you don't just want to have your mind continually open like a sieve so that you become scatterbrained.
Well, this is I mean, I don't want to get too off topic, but it seems like there's this assumption, or there's debates about whether or not we ought to have free speech absolutism. That's assuming that we can have free speech absolutism, and so in principle, I don't know if you could even have free speech absolutism. When you think about it, it would be like a society of schizophrenics, and not it would be a society of schizophrenics having an infinitely long debate where there could never be a single decision point that could ever be arrived at, because to do so would be to grant some sort of priority of one proposition over the other. And so I don't think any such society could actually function without flying apart.
Yeah, I think that could very well be the fundamental problem with it. And as a matter of historical fact, all known societies have proscribed speech. There's never been a total free speech society. The problem now is that the proscriptions, so the things that you're not allowed to say, like the blasphemies, as it were, against the gods of secular liberalism, they are not known with clarity. So people are stepping over these invisible tripwires and, oh, hold on, what? I got fired. What did I say? I don't know what the rules were. So that's the problem we got now. Free speech absolutism is certainly not a Catholic position regarding faith and morals, because free speech is curtailed for the sake of public order and the common good. So
Mhm.
I could
Yeah.
put together a pretty convincing, to the average adolescent, steelman case for some kind of worldview based on fornication, based on a really superficial understanding of evolutionary biology with some of the
Mhm.
red pill ideology mixed
Yeah.
in, and make it sound like it's somehow natural. And you could pump that out
Mhm.
into schools, and you could tell all these kids that they need to be having sex before marriage as early as possible. Like when you're 13, 14, it's natural. Now,
Right.
that would be
Right.
a really grave social evil, because although
Yep.
all those ideas can be refuted, you can package them in such a way that the rational case for the counter argument is actually quite a hard thing to accept, when the appeal of lust, on the other hand, means that what you put out, the false ideas, the damaging ones, are just so attractive.
Mhm.
And that acknowledges the fact that human nature being what it is, vice comes really easily to us, and we can fall for slogans and we can fall for propositions for all kinds of reasons apart from the truth.
I was gonna say there's yeah, not just propositions, but there's any amount of like non-propositional content that can really override. Just images that can override um, people's rational capacities. Where you don't even need to make the argument. You just flood the epistemic space with pictures and imagery
Yeah, right.
and sensation and that can do you know uh, any effective psyop operation that you read about, countries trying to take out other countries. That's part of it. It's
Yeah.
a big part of it.
Yeah, that's actually a more profound example than the one that I gave, because the church fathers say that that's primarily how the devil operates, is by working on the imagination of man through suggestion. So he
Mm,
can't force sin, but he can tempt to it really effectively as the father of
yeah.
lies through suggestion in exactly the way that you describe. And people
Mm,
will
mm.
acknowledge the power of that when they talk about what's being shown to kids on TikTok or MTV music videos or whatever it is, because played
Yeah,
out often enough, that's already suggestive.
yeah, yeah. It's propaganda. Yeah, it's brainwashing. I think would not be a like exaggerated term when you
Right.
think about, particularly, the how the perniciousness of TikTok.
Well, that brings us back again to the duty of fathers in the home, doesn't it? And Leo's final comment I want to draw everyone's attention to is that in propagating Christian truth and warding off errors, the zeal of the laity should, as far as possible, be brought actively into play. So, this is about keeping watch and the protector role of the father extending to, well, primarily being about matters of morality and religion. That's the father's highest duty.
Mhm. That sounds correct. I just had a thought in this space. I'm thinking if somebody hears us and they, okay, you know, do what Pope Leo is suggesting, does that mean I'm supposed to go over the head of my local priest? Does that mean I'm supposed to get into, taking pulling rank, taking over his job for him? Isn't that going to cause conflict within my parish? Any thoughts on that as to make those things gel?
Well, there's no suggestion here that we take on the special offices or duties of priests, let alone bishops. But what Leo is saying is that there's far more that laymen ought to be doing than they are. And that, as Tim often points out, the family is the domestic church. So fathers
Mm.
already have a priesthood role within the home. So priest, prophet, king is what the tripartite role of the father is, according to Catholic doctrine. And that we've essentially had a few decades now of that not being taken seriously. And if we are to recover, especially the domestic church priesthood part of that, then we need to return to fathers being more assiduous about catechesis. And also, I think there's a lot that can be done by men, especially unmarried men, forming study groups within parishes as well.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
ideally, you want the
Yep.
priest involved in that too. But if it's not the
Yep.
case that the priest is involved, then that doesn't mean it's a bad thing to be doing. We should all know, for
Yeah.
example, if necessity requires it, how to baptize somebody. So that's one of the duties of laymen. If there's no priest available, it can be done in extremis by a layman. So
Mm.
there's lots that can be done. I just want to finish with a quick recap of some of the things that lay people need to understand to the maximum. And this again, I'm just taking this from Callan and McHugh's Moral Theology. So we start with the creed. Know that God is one and that there are three divine persons, Father, Son, Holy Ghost. God is the maker of the world and that he will reward everyone according to his deeds. One should know about Christ, that he's the Son of God and God himself, that he was miraculously born of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that he suffered and died for our salvation, that he rose from the dead and by his own power ascended into glory and will come again after the general resurrection to judge all. One should know about the church, that it is the one true church founded by Christ, in which are found the communication of spiritual goods and the forgiveness of sins. So that's the creed. The next one is the Decalogue. Know the general meaning of the commandments so as to be able to regulate one's own conduct by them. They say that it is not necessary that a child should know all the kinds of crimes and vices that are forbidden by the commandments. Remember, as Catholics, we take a capacious view of the commandments. So, although there's only 10, they cover many different kinds of sins. That's what they entail. And Callan and McHugh say that when you're teaching children, it is better for the children not to know much about evil. So you wouldn't want to talk about what the commandment forbidding adultery truly involves in terms of all the various kinds of sexual sin. You leave that for later on. Regarding the virtues, which is the next thing, creed, decalogue, virtues, one should know enough to be able to apply to one's own life for ordinary cases what a virtuous life demands. Both old and young should know in substance the acts of faith, hope, charity, and contrition, for to these all are bound. The young should know the laws of the church that apply to them, for example, the law of abstinence. The older people should understand the law of fasting, which they are bound to observe. And then after the creed, the decalogue, and the virtues, we get the sacraments. One should know substantially the doctrine of the sacraments that are necessary for all, namely baptism, penance, and the Eucharist. Since all the faithful have the duty of baptizing in case of necessity, all should know how to administer lay baptism properly and fruitfully. When the time comes for receiving a sacrament, the recipient should know enough to receive it validly, licitly, and devoutly, although less knowledge is required in children and in the dying who cannot be fully instructed. So that's the sacraments. Then we've got two more areas where there are requirements for laymen as well. We've got the special duties, which is that one should know the essentials of one's condition or state of life and the right way to perform its ordinary duties. Children should understand the obligations of pupils and of subjects. The married, religious, and priests should know the respective duties of their respective states. One thing I want to point out there is that fathers in particular, mothers too, but fathers in particular, need to understand that parents are the primary educators of children, even if they go to school, and especially in morality and religion. So that's one really big thing that fathers need to understand and act on, because it's one of the ways in which the faith has been weakened most in recent years, as we've touched on many times. So a clearer understanding of what parental duties are is one of the big aims of the C-Masc podcast. Then we've got what citizens owe to the community, and then going up, people like officials, judges, lawyers, physicians, teachers, all have particular responsibilities to the public implied by their particular professions. And then the last thing is the Lord's Prayer. The substance of this form of prayer should be known by all, namely, that God is to be glorified, and that we should ask of him with confidence goods of soul and body, and deliverance from evil. Though Christ is the only necessary mediator, 1 Timothy 2:5, it is most suitable that all should know substantially the Hail Mary, namely, that we should ask the intercession of her who is the Mother of God and our Mother. So that's a recap of the fundamentals that all laymen are required to know to the utmost of their capacity. Hopefully that has been helpful for everybody. It's been good for me to clarify this material. I don't know how you feel about it, Mike.
Yeah, certainly, definitely. I mean, it's good to have learned it, and and to clarify what we're actually called to do.
That's right. The idea that there's a call to duty here that people need to rise to, I think, should be a really invigorating and enlivening message, because men do best with a mission, and this is the most important one you could possibly have. All right, it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Mike, as always, and I look forward to the Best of the West Book Club on Tuesday. Everyone watches C-Masc. Feel free to join us on Tuesdays when we do our book discussion, various material. Hope to see you there. Take care. See you, Mike.
Take care.